Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Happy whatever day of the week it is that you're watching, but it is Friday for us. So happy Friday. My name is Jessica, and I am a producer here at EOL, and I'm just here to welcome everybody in and introduce our incredible host, Liza Hanks, today, who is going to be offering an amazing summer series this summer, all about empowering women and wills. And so today is going to be estate planning for new moms. I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about Liza, and then she is going to jump in and just give us all an incredible education about how we can become empowered about claiming our voice in this process. So Liza Hanks is a partner at the GCA Law Partners LLP in Mountain View, where she practices estate planning, trust administration, and probate law. She's also the author of Every Californian's Guide to Estate Planning, Wills, Trusts, and Everything Else, and the Trustee's Legal Companion. So she's specialized in estate planning, trust, and probate law by the State Bar of California. She is the mother of 2 children. Her practice focuses on estate planning, trust administration, and probate for families of all ages, with an emphasis on educating her clients so they understand and maintain their estate plans over time. So I know I'm super excited about this, and I'm really excited to turn this over to Liza. So welcome, everyone, and Liza, take it away.
I will do that. Hi, everybody. So first, I have to tell you that neither of my children shows any interest in being an attorney. So I just want to share that with both of you. Share that about both of them with all of you. So here's my plan. I thought that I would talk for maybe a half an hour generally about what you need to think about in terms of estate planning when you have a new kid. And then I would like to open this up to questions. We don't have that big a group, so it should be a good chance for anybody and everybody who wants to have a question answered to ask it. Best if you can put your questions in the Q&A section. It makes it easier for me to see it. And I don't know where you all are coming from. I practice in California, so I'm going to speak about California, but generally speaking, the issues I'm talking about would apply in any state, with the possible exception of Louisiana, which is just a little weird because they have a different legal code than the rest of the United States because they were once part of France. Okay, so let's just start with what happens when you have a new baby. I mean, in addition to becoming a mom, is now you have this little person that you need to think about legally. And the biggest thing that a new parent needs to consider is naming guardians for kids. And the reason is, if you're not around to raise that kid to age 18, somebody else is going to have to do that. That person is called a guardian. So there's a guardian of the person, that's a custodial guardian, right? The person who makes sure that kids get up and go to school and eat their breakfast and go to the doctor. And then there's a guardian of the estate, which is the money person, the person who manages the money for the kids. They're often the same people, but they don't have to be. And so actually, I built my practice. I started this practice when my son, who's now 20, was born. And I gave this particular kind of talk to all the new moms groups at all the hospitals around where I live. And the amazing thing was that these new moms would hold on to the handout and call me like 2 years later when they finally got a good night's sleep. So I guess I want to start with, don't push yourself too hard right now. If you have a newborn, it's a really hard time just physically and emotionally. But just know this is something you should put in place, at some point when you can do it. Because and here's my big, if you remember nothing else about what I'm going to tell you today, it's this. If you don't pick a guardian, you just punt on the whole thing because it's too horrible to consider not being around to raise your kids. It just makes you too upset to consider. If you just don't do it, okay, it's one of those grown-up things that just doesn't go away. All you do is give up control over this super important decision because it will get made, if it has to get made, because you die before the kid's 18 when they're a legal adult. And so there's a huge benefit in you doing it, right? Because you know your family, you know your brother, you know your brother's wife, you know your mom, you know your mother-in-law, and you're in the best position to choose somebody of anybody, right? Even if it's imperfect, even if nobody could do as good a job as you in raising your kids. What happens if you don't make a designation and somebody needs to be appointed? Who makes that decision? So it's judge. and the judge doesn't know any of those people. So let me just start with what would happen if you didn't name a guardian. So and I'm making some assumptions, right? I'm talking about you in the singular. If you're in a couple or you have a partner and you die, right? The child's surviving parent is not a guardian. The child's surviving parent is the child's surviving parent and would just continue to raise the kids. And that applies even if you've been divorced, which I'll get to later. But I'm talking about the scenario in which either you and your partner both pass away or you're a single parent and you die. So if we have a little kid out there with no surviving parent, then a judge has to appoint a guardian to age 18. And it's a little bit like an adoption process. It's a judicial procedure. There'll be somebody in the family usually will petition to be named as guardian, right? Somebody will step forward and say, it should be me, right? It could be your sister, it could be your mom, it could be your brother. And then the courts would investigate that person, make sure they would be an appropriate placement. They would have a hearing. Everybody in the family would have notice of that hearing and the chance to show up and tell the judge why that's a bad idea. And then the judge, at least in my state, what the law says is they're supposed to make an appointment in the best interest of the child. So it doesn't say they have to do what you say. It doesn't say if you nominate guardians, they have to pick them, but that's what almost always happens. So if there's nobody named, then someone in the family has to step forward and petition, and then the judge appoints somebody. Okay, that's you having absolutely no control over who raises your kids. So let's talk about the better alternative, right? You name a guardian for your children. How do you do that? Well, at least in the state in which I practice and in many states, you can just do it in writing. It could just be on a piece of paper in your desk drawer, but that's not usually how anybody does it. Usually we do that with a will. And the reason that you use a will to name guardians is because you can do two things with the will. You can name guardians for minor kids, and you can put something in place to manage those assets for the kids until they're a little bit older than 18. I mean, my kids are 25 and 20, and they're starting to grow up, but even they're kind of young to inherit money, even for somebody who doesn't have that much. 18 is really a young age to inherit everything a parent leaves behind. And so a will would allow you to put those dollars in a trust or manage them in a custodial account for a child until they're 25 or older. So usually they go together. You name a guardian and you put something in place to manage money for the kids in the same document, which is a will. Wills are not hard to put together. You don't need expensive lawyers to do them. Again, in California where I practice, but in many states, the State Bar Association has a free downloadable will that's just kind of a fill in the blank form. You fill in the blanks and then you sign it in front of two witnesses. You don't notarize a will, okay? And that's because anybody can do a will. You don't need any money at all. You have to pay $15 a signature to notarize a document, but a will doesn't require that. It just requires two witnesses who are not what's called interested parties, so people who don't benefit from your will. So that's how you do it, and hopefully that's a little bit about why you should do it. But what I find most often with young parents is they just don't know who to name. They just have a really hard time figuring out how to go about choosing somebody to do this really important job. So I kind of wish that we were on Zoom or something so that I could actually see you guys and know who I'm talking to and get a sense of whether that's an issue for you. So I'm talking into the void here, but I have some ideas about how you might go about picking a guardian. Um, and I and then maybe in the questions you can ask me more questions about that. But the first thing I would say is it's probably a good idea to sit down and make a list of your values. Like, what's important to you? Like, is it important that your guardian has a sense of humor, reads a lot of books, doesn't watch TV, votes one way or the other, is of a certain religious faith, lives in a certain kind of city, is married, isn't married, has a dog, doesn't have a dog, like whatever. Just brainstorm all the things that you would like in an ideal guardian and then rank your preferences. Like, you're not going to get all of them, right? So the trick is, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 things that matter the most to you? And in the people I've worked with, it's really varied a lot. Some people feel really strongly that they want their kids to be raised in a certain city, or they want a certain kind of approach to education or certain kind of faith. I don't have a judgment about any of that. I think what's important is kind of identifying that for yourselves. Okay, and then you make a list of all the possible people you can think of in your family, um, or your friends, they don't have to be family members, who might be able to be a guardian. And if you're married or you have a partner, I would strongly advise you to do this separately first, because you might have different lists of values and different lists of people. And that can be kind of instructive for the two of you to go off to your own corner separately first. And then you have to sit down and kind of eliminate people based on the values you've come up with, right? So like, oh, that sister-in-law won't work because her apartment is entirely white and my son would make a complete wreck of that apartment. I'm speaking from experience here. Um, or, gee, I don't think that sister would be good because they already have 3 kids and they have kind of a small house, and where would our kids live? So these kind of practical considerations. And so, you might just end up with 1 or 2 or 3 people at that point. Some of my cynical lawyer friends would be like, just cross the list off all the people who are unacceptable and just see who's left. But that's kind of a negative spin on it. But you definitely don't have to name family members. You can absolutely name friends. Um, Goddaughters and godsons, godparents are not legally recognized roles. And so if you want a godparent to be a guardian, you still have to nominate them in your will. Okay, so let's say we've come up with 2 or 3 people that, while they're not perfect, could do the job. That would be an ideal outcome for the Liza method, but sometimes people can't even get that far and they get stuck. And here's some suggestions for what happens if you get stuck. First thing is narrow your time frame, right? Don't sit down and think, "Oh my God, I'm going to solve every problem about my family for all time right now," because I guarantee you won't. So just think about the next 3 to 5 years and promise yourself that in 3 to 5 years, you'll revisit this. It's not hard to update a will. And sometimes what happens there, especially if with babies, is grandparents come to be the right people. And if your mom is 70 and your baby is 4 and they like adore each other and it's party time, great. That could be a really good fit for the next 5 years. But I think as your mom approaches 75 or 80 and your kid becomes a teenager or a teenager, but definitely teenagers and 80-year-olds are not the best combination, right? So it's okay if right now grandparents are the right people and they won't be in 5 or 10 years. Just focus on now. So that's my first, problem solving suggestion. Another one is, oh man, my sister would be a perfect guardian, but like she's terrible with money and she wouldn't manage it well and she'd buy them all ponies and they'd never get to college. That's fairly typical too, right? The nurturing, warm person doesn't have all the skills that you need. So there, the fact that there's a guardian for money and a guardian for custodianship matters because they could be different people. So you could say, my sister, Lucy, would be a great guardian. She'd be a great home for the kids. But my friend from college, Sasha, is a financial advisor in Chicago, and she would do a really good job managing the money. So you can definitely bifurcate those roles if the one person doesn't have both of those skills. So nothing wrong with doing that. And then another problem I run into is, I wrote in my notes, the bad spouse. Sometimes I'll hear that, oh, my brother John would be a great guardian, but I really don't want his wife raising my kids if something happens to John. And so there, what you can do is you can name just John, right? John is the guardian. His wife, Catherine, lives there. So the kids would be around her, but only John would have the authority to like sign a doctor's letter or sign the kids up for school or send them to summer camp. And if John and Catherine get divorced, which you secretly hope they will, the kids would stay with John because she was never their legal guardian. So that's one way to deal with it. Another thing that comes up sometimes around couples is, well, I could name John and Catherine together. I like Catherine in this story. Let's give her a different name. I could name Larry and Margaret together as guardians, so together. And I could say in my will, I nominate them both, but if they get divorced, I want the kids to stay with Larry. Okay, so now we've resolved that issue. Or I could just say I want Larry and Margaret to be the guardians and just leave it to them to work it out if they ever do divorce, where the kids go. So there's some ideas about couples. So those, I hope that's helpful in some way. And the other thing, looping back to the sort of, okay, now we come up with who, and then how you execute a will. And then if you were to pass away, instead of the random family member petitioning the court to be named as guardian, instead what would happen is the guardians nominated in your will would petition to be appointed as the guardian, and their evidence that you wanted them is the will, right? In the will, you say, I nominate Larry and Margaret to be the guardians of my children. And then the court, while they're not legally bound to follow your wishes as a parent, they're going to follow your wishes as a parent unless the court investigation turns something up that turns out, we didn't know, you didn't know that Larry has, a prior felony record or commit fraud or something like that. So that would be sort of unexpected, I would think. But the point is the judge still makes the decision. You don't get to choose the guardian, you just nominate a guardian. But still, the court will take that into account. And then do you pick more than one? And I would say, yeah, pick one or two or three in that order, like first choice, second choice, third choice. Because, who knows, maybe if this were to come to pass and your cousin Larry can't do it because right then he has triplets, and his life is out of control. So he could just say, no, I can't do it. And then it would go to number 2 or number 3. So naming more than one person makes your documents a little bit more, I don't know, resilient is the word I would use. Okay, so now you've picked somebody. So here's my advice to you. Go spend some time with them. Like go on a road trip, go to the beach, go on vacation, do something. Because the number of people I've worked with over the last 20 years who've gone through this exercise with me and then called me up like a week later and said, you know what, I forget about my brother. Like we took his new car to the beach and my kid's ice cream cone fell in the back seat, screwed up the upholstery. My brother lost his mind and I didn't realize he had an anger problem and I don't want him to be my guardian. So my point there is when you're thinking about people in this capacity, spend some time with them. You might see something about the way they are with your kids that you didn't see before, for better or worse. So that's one thing. Next thing, should you tell them? And my answer is yeah. You should say, hey, I'm doing some estate planning. I'd like to name you as guardian. Is that something that I can do? Because you might find out that like your niece Joan is so popular that her dance card is full. Like 5 other people in the preschool have already asked her to be the guardian. And she might have to politely decline because like that's a lot of promises to make to a lot of people. Or you might find out that Joan is so into doing it, but actually she would need to buy a bigger house because, she lives in a small house. And where I live in the Bay Area, real estate is super expensive, right? So it's not a trivial thing to buy a bigger house to take your kids. And so then you might have a real discussion about like, well, what would that take to make it work? Well, what if I bought some life insurance? What if I got $500,000 of life insurance, and then that would be money that you could use to buy a bigger house. So, you might have a conversation with them that's more practical. So that's a really good reason to tell them. And then do you tell the people you didn't pick? Like, do you sit down and think, so this is like a pre-COVID example, but since we're heading into post-COVID times, maybe next Thanksgiving, you sit down and you turn to your mother-in-law and you say, guess what? We're doing some estate planning and we didn't pick you as guardians of the adorable grandchildren. Would I recommend that? My answer is no, I would not recommend that level of candor. It's sort of hurtful and the odds of you dying before your children 18 are quite low. So why bother making everybody feel terrible about something that may or may not happen and most likely won't? So I wouldn't do that. But if you're concerned that your mother-in-law, would be just crushed to find out that in the extremely low possibility situation in which you do pass away in a car accident, she wasn't named as guardian, you could leave a letter behind only to be opened in the event of your death that explains the choices you made. Like, hey, mother-in-law, we totally love you, but we chose our friends because our children's best friends are their children, and we really wanted them to be raised in a home with other kids in the community that they live in already. And we want you to have a rich relationship with them as they grow up, but we didn't want them to have to move to Ohio. And that still might not make your mother-in-law feel any better, but it might help her understand your thinking on that. So those are questions that have come up, in the time that I've done this. And then the last thing, I'm just looking at the clock. The last thing I wanted to talk about before we get into Q&A, and I see that there's at least one question there, is what happens if you're divorced, right? Because a lot of times people who are divorced are not really thrilled about their ex-spouses raising the kids. And there I don't really have such good news, which is that your ex-spouse is still the surviving parent. So they would raise your kids absent some really good reason that they shouldn't. And so I have worked with people who have said in their wills that they don't want their ex-spouses to be the guardians of the children, but that doesn't have any legal teeth there, but they're just telling the judge that they don't want that. And the other thing to know is that your ex could still be the parent and choose not to be the guardian, right? You don't have to be dead to have guardians. People who are sent to prison have guardians appointed for their children too. So they're not severing their parental rights. They're just not acting as the custodial parent. So, it's possible that a divorced spouse may not want the kids and the guardian could still be appointed and he or she would still be the parent. So those are some ideas about divorce. So let me think. Okay, one more thing. The other thing that you should think about when you're a new parent, but actually you should just think about it because you're a human being, is two other legal documents, powers of attorney for healthcare and finance. In some states, they have different names. So I think in every state, power of attorney for finance is a pretty common term, but the healthcare directive is sometimes called a healthcare proxy. But these are documents that appoint people to act for you if you're sick or incapacitated in some way. And if you gave birth in the hospital, you probably had to fill out an advance directive there. So that there was somebody with legal authority to make decisions for you if you weren't able to make them for yourself, like if you were in a coma or unconscious. And those are documents that you should have in place, not just when you have young kids, but anytime, right? Because any of us could get hurt or sick. And again, these are documents that you don't need a fancy lawyer to do. Powers of attorney are available online for each state, and so are advanced healthcare directives. I don't have a link for a power of attorney for every state, but the AARP, believe it or not, has 50 state advanced healthcare directives that you can download for free, even if you're not old. So that's a helpful resource. Okay, so that's it, I think. In the chat bar, I've posted links to two things that might be useful for you. So one is an article you can download from my website called something like How to Pick Guardians for Your Kids. And honestly, I think I wrote that like 18 years ago, but it's still a good article, right? And it's most of I think so. And it's most of what I've talked about so far today, but just in writing in one place that you can keep. And then there's a link to my latest book, which is here. And it's called Every Californian's Guide to Estate Planning. And I'm not trying to sell the book, but articles 4 and 5 of this book are basically what I've just been talking about with you, which is how to pick guardians for kids, why to pick guardians for kids, and how to manage money for minor children. And that's not California specific. So if you wanted more information, the book would be a good resource. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to some questions. And so I'm going to go to well, thank you, Denisa. I'm glad that was clear. Okay, so here I've got 3 questions so far, and I would encourage all of you to ask more. So the first one says, what if the guardian changes their mind and doesn't want to be the guardian anymore? And this may be after the parents have died. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing because I was thinking about this short story called The Ransom of Red Chief, where they kidnap this kid and then they pay the parents to take the kid back. So, okay, so a guardianship right, is a legal appointment. So the judge appoints somebody to be the custodial guardian of that kid. So I haven't had this come up in my practice, but I would imagine that if the guardian, something came up in the guardian's life where they were no longer able to serve, they would have to go back to court and they would have to ask the judge to appoint a different guardian. And then the judge would go back to your will and the judge would, I imagine, or the guardian, the first guardian would go back to your will and contact the second guardian who would then petition to be appointed. So you'd have to go through the court though, because once you're appointed, now you're accountable to the court for the well-being and care of the minor. So that's my answer to that. Next one from an anonymous attendee. How do you know the guardians will spend the money for the child only and not for themselves? Well, that's why it's really important who you pick, right? I mean, in all of this stuff in estate planning, picking the right people is really key, right? If you pick a dishonorable, thieving person, it's pretty hard to enforce this stuff. I mean, there are laws in place, okay? So the formal answer would be, if a guardian is stealing money from children, you know, somebody could bring a legal action on behalf of the children to get that guardian dismissed and get the money paid back, okay? But in real life, that's going to be expensive and hard to do. And quite often when people steal money like that, they don't have it around to give back. So better to pick a good guardian. The second thing is a guardian of the estate. So the guardian of the money, if appointed by the court, has to do annual accountings to the court, and they have to show the court what they spent the money on. So again, there's some judicial oversight there. And the reason I'm being a little hesitant is that would be in the absence of a parent's will, right? If there's just nothing in place and the court appoints a guardian, they're going to appoint a guardian of the estate. But most wills will say, I appoint this person as guardian, and I'm going to leave the money in trust for my children until they're 30, and my brother Bob is going to be the trustee. Okay, so if you do it that way, the court is not asking for an annual accounting. In fact, one of the reasons you do it that way is so that you don't have to make an annual accounting to the court, which is pain and expensive. And there, if your brother Bob absconds with the money, there are all kinds of rules about trustees not doing that. But again, how that is enforced is somebody has to go after Bob for breach of his duty as trustee and go after the money and recover it, both of which are hard to do. So you have to think hard about who you appoint. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, so this is from Natalie. Thank you, Natalie, for being brave enough to use your name. This is so helpful. Thank you so much. My kids are a bit older, 12 and 14. But I still want to put a will in place and pick a guardian. Can you recommend a website to do a will on my own? I'm in California, smiley face. Okay, so first, when you have older kids, see, I don't know who's on this call. I mean, one of the weird things about doing this is like you're all invisible to me here. So as kids get older, right, they're not as fungible as little kids, right? It's relatively easy to take a 2-year-old and move them to Ohio, right? But a 14-year-old maybe doesn't want to go to Ohio. Maybe the 14-year-old wants to stay in their high school or their middle school and be with their friends, right? They're much more connected to their community the older they get. And so in California, and I think in most states, when a kid reaches a certain age, they get to have some input as to which guardians are appointed. So in California, it's the age is 14. So, you know, the judge would say like, hey, do you want to go to your Uncle Bob's? And they're like, no, I don't really want to go to my Uncle Bob's. I want to like go to my friend Sally's, you know, and maybe you can work that out maybe that can be worked out with the court. So that's the first thing to know. And should you put a will in place when your kids are 12 and 14? Yeah, you should, because, you know, you still have 4 years for the 14-year-old and 6 years for the 12-year-old where they are too young to own their own money and they can't live by themselves, you know? So you need a will with guardians until your kids are 18. And for doing, okay, so Jessica, who's assisting me in the background here with EOL Collective, may be able to post some links on the chat that are offered through EOL Collective. I'm not as familiar with the resources there as I am with the following website, which I'll put in the chat too. So hold on a second. You can watch me type. It'll be thrilling for everybody. So nolo.com is a website. They're a self-help legal resource. I write books for them. Okay, so I have a connection to them, but I write books for them because they're the best self-help legal publishers out there, I think. All of their editors are lawyers, which means you have to rewrite everything like 5,000 times, which means that their books are clear and accurate. And they have a they have a piece of software called Will Maker, and I think it's like $100. And you can fill out a questionnaire, and then it generates a will that you can sign in front of 2 witnesses, and it also does powers of attorney for every state except Louisiana, which is weird. So that's a resource. The California State Bar has a statutory will that you can Google and download. That's another way to do it for free. Here's one thing I didn't talk about, and I probably should have, and I apologize. The thing about wills is if you die with a will and you have enough money, before anything goes to your kids or whomever you leave it to, you also have to go through something called probate. And probate is the court supervising the settling of an estate. Okay, there's nothing inherently evil about probate. It can be quite helpful because it's got a very clear beginning, middle, and end, and a whole bunch of steps in between. The problem is in some states, like the one I live in, okay, probate is super expensive and really slow. Like really expensive. Like if you have a $1 million house, that's $23,000 in probate fees right there. And it goes to somebody like me, goes to the lawyer, which is the worst, right? So avoiding probate can be an estate planning goal that's different than just naming guardians for your kids. So lots of people in many states, but not all states, right? Depends on where you live. In some states, probate is relatively quick and relatively cheap, like Washington State is one, New York State is another, where people don't do living trusts. But in California, people do as a way to settle their estate without going to court. So the documents I'm talking about in this seminar, wills in particular, definitely solve the problem of naming guardians for kids and taking care of their money till they're old enough to manage it. But it doesn't address the issue of avoiding probate. So it's not a perfect solution, but the reason I'm focusing on it is because if you have little kids, you usually don't have that many assets, right? And I think it's important to solve the biggest problems first. So you can put that in place, and then as like your life comes down, you get a little more money. If you buy a house, then you can consider kind of upgrading your estate plan and doing what's called a living trust. You're still going to do a will because that's where guardians always get named. But you have a different way of transferring the property. So I didn't want to talk too much about that in this seminar because it's like related but a different topic. Oh, good. So Jessica posted a link to something useful on creating a will. That's also on EOL Collective. So let's see, do I have any more questions? I'm not sure how this works. Oh yes, here's another one from Marielle, who was brave enough to use her name. Go you. Okay. This is okay. So I'm just going to read this to you. It says, "Thanks for your helpful information." You're welcome. "I just caught up with listening to your podcast episodes." Oh, thank you. I do have a podcast. I'll tell you about that in a minute. "And they're all really helpful and entertaining." Smiley face. "I'm not a mother yet, but I'm here to gather information to pass on to my friends who are new moms. Do you have any tips on gracefully bringing up this topic with them?" Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, you could say that you're thrilled about their new children, and are they aware of the fact that part of being a parent is thinking about who would raise their kids if they can't. I mean, they might just instantly burst into tears. I don't know. It can be a touchy subject, but I have found over the years that the most effective approach to this is not browbeating and fear mongering, but more in the spirit of sort of an invitation that there are some very simple things that you can do that will be of great benefit to the kids if something terrible happens. You know, it doesn't have to be super complicated. They don't have to hire an attorney. They can just put the basics in place. So I hope that's helpful. Another way you can think about it, or, you know, again, because I live in California, and we have earthquakes, right? And so, you know, one of the things you're supposed to do is have an earthquake kit. Like we sort of have an earthquake kit in the back of the yard that my husband put together that has like water and a flashlight and cash and some food. If you have little kids, it should have like diapers. But the idea there is, yeah, we hope we never have to use the earthquake kit, right? But if there's an earthquake, we're going to be really glad we had it. And I think that's the best way to talk to new parents about this stuff. Not like this big heavy duty thing that you have to feel terrible about that you haven't done, but just like, here's one more grown up thing that you could do that would make your life, the life of the people you love the most, easier in a really tough time. So that's how I would approach it. And as for my podcast, so I have some exciting, so I have a podcast, has about 13 episodes. I'll post the link in the chat in a second. It's called Life, well, it was called Life, Death, Law, but I'm actually rebooting it and I'm going to call it Women in Wills because I want to focus more specifically on issues around women. Why, you might ask? And the answer is, women are like 51% of the population. Women tend to not engage in estate planning. They tend to push it away. They tend to think it's boring and taxes and like dude lawyers in bad suits making them feel guilty. And I guess I really want to encourage women to reconsider and say this is one more area like around money where we can empower ourselves and by becoming engaged in the process, make it a richer process. I mean, there is a lot of value actually in realizing that someday you will pass away and that you can, by planning, make that easier, for the people you love. And you can pass on more than your checkbook, right? You can consider your values. You can think about charity. You can think about what you want your kids to know about you after you're gone. I mean, it's actually kind of a good contemplation to have. It's not just about taxes and guys in bad suits. And so that's kind of the spirit of these courses and the spirit of the podcast going forward is that women have a lot to offer and nobody's really been asking us what's important to us. And I think it's time. So that's what I have to say about that. So maybe we're just going to end early because I don't see any more questions, but I'm super happy to answer them if anybody has any. Let me pull up the podcast link too. And because, then it'll be like, it's always nice to have more people listen because I have had the benefit of really, really good, generous guests who have talked about really interesting things. So here's the link to the podcast. And I invite you all to listen. It's completely free. And just so you know that this is one of a series, I propose to do 12 Women in Wills classes on the third Friday of every month on EOL as a way to build listenership for the podcast and for me to get used to giving online courses and to be of value to this community. So thanks for having me. And now I'm going to say, what do we do now, Jessica? I don't know. Do we just end? She's out there somewhere.
I'm here. We're just gonna play a little. We're gonna play a little fight song to keep everybody motivated as everyone
Oh,
leaves.
wait. I think there's one more question.
Oh, we do got a couple more coming in. All right. Well, that's what will happen, Liza. Is when you sign off, I'll play the music.
Okay, I'll keep going till the questions
All
are
right.
done. So
Great.
Nisha says, I work as a palliative care social worker. I encourage all the attendees to do this work because you never know when your time will come. Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? Right. We all think we're going to live forever, and the only people who live forever are estate planners. I'm just letting you in on that secret. And then Natalie said, thank you. Well, thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. And now I think we'll sign off. So we can play our fight song, and maybe I'll see you guys next month.